A very good morning to the distinguished guests, esteemed delegates, respected members of the organizing committee and their students. I'm Nausheen Ali, research scholar in the Department of English, Maulana Azad National Urdu University, and it is my privilege to extend my sincere welcome to each and everyone present here today. This plenary session marks the commencement of our two-day international conference on translating cultures, exploring the intersections of language and literature, organized by the National Translation Mission, Central Institute of Indian Languages, Mysore, in collaboration with the Department of English, Maulana Azad National Urdu University, Hyderabad. It gives me immense pleasure to host the first plenary session of this conference with a hope to celebrate the power of translation and understand the complexities and concerns associated with it. It is my privilege to now introduce the chair of our first plenary session, Professor Ismat Mehdi. I request you, Madam, to please grace the stage with your presence. Professor Ismat Mehdi is a former professor of Arabic, English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. During the early 90s, Professor Mehdi was deputed to the Embassy of India, Cairo, Egypt, as the first Secretary Culture and Director of Maulana Azad Centre for Indian Culture. She's widely traveled and has been associated with many cultural organizations in Hyderabad. Post-retirement from IFLU, Professor Mehdi has been the Managing Trustee of Sarvodaya International Trust AP chapter. She has also been involved in interfaith dialogue and is the Muslim member of the team from India to the United States Presbyterian Meets. I welcome you, Madam, for this plenary session. Ladies and gentlemen, we have two distinguished speakers for this plenary session. I now invite our first speaker, Professor Pushpinder Syal, to please come up on the stage. Professor Pushpinder Syal is a former professor from the Department of English and Cultural Studies, Punjab University, Chandigarh, and a prominent member of the Society for Promotion of Science and Technology in India. Apart from this, Professor Syal has worked as a director of English and Foreign Languages University, Lucknow campus, and as advisor and secretary to the Vice Chancellor of Punjab University, Chandigarh. She has also conducted British Council courses on teacher training and been a certified IELTS examiner with the British Council for 15 years. She has many other distinguished roles to her credit as well. Professor Syal has published over 50 papers and 2 books. I welcome you, Madam. I now invite to the stage the second distinguished speaker of this plenary session, Professor Amina Kishore. Professor Amina Kishore is an eminent educator who worked in Aligarh Muslim University as a professor of English for over 38 years. She has also worked as a principal of AMU Women's College. She is former dean of the School of Languages, Linguistics and Indology, and the former head of the Department of English, Maulana Azad National Urdu University, Hyderabad. Professor Amina Kishore has published research papers in several reputed national and international journals. She is fluent in Urdu, Telugu, and Hindi and translates between these languages and English. The campus of MANUU itself is a live example of her administrative prominence. I welcome you, Madam. I now request our distinguished chair to kindly initiate the plenary session.
Morning to everyone. This is the first plenary session, and I invite Pushpa to start. She has already been introduced, so let us hear her.
Good morning, friends and respected colleagues. Start with the words of Guru Gobind Singh. इन्हीं की कृपा के सजे हम हैं. I would like to discuss today, this morning, a methodological approach to the translation of knowledge texts. I hope that the students here will find it useful. I start with saying that to enable us to evolve approaches which are relevant for students and general readers in our society today, we could study the history of translation of knowledge texts in India, science as well as other subjects. It will provide a sense of continuity for us in the Indian context, much needed today, that the Mughal and colonial periods were eras of translation in many fields. One historian I will draw on is Shanta Ramakrishna, whose article, Democratization of Knowledge in 19th Century India, is there in Prasad edited Translation and Culture, Indian Perspectives. And I quote from that there was a successful cross-fertilization of Indian and Islamic sciences, especially in the field of medicine, and the role of translation in this cannot be overlooked, unquote. In the second half of the 19th century, a reaction supporting democratization of knowledge and teaching of science in Indian languages gained momentum. Apart from the writing and translations of knowledge texts in languages such as Bengali by Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, Madhusudan Gupta, Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, in Marathi by Balashastri Jambekar, Professor of Mathematics, and Master Ramachandra, also Mathematics, Delhi University, in Urdu, there were efforts to translate these texts in lesser established languages also. None of these translators had extreme views on nativism. They acknowledged Western science, but the impulse that informed their work was to disseminate as well as examine the connections between indigenous knowledge and the so-called new the indigenous knowledge and the so-called new knowledge. Now, two observations can be made. One, that despite Enlightenment, all of Europe was by no means modernized to the extent that the narrative tells us to believe. And the spread of knowledge in Europe was quite uneven and not completely democratic. Similarly, Indian people were also not living in the dark ages either. Indians were always aware of the role of science in sociocultural transformation and therefore did not adopt wholesale the perspectives and purposes of colonization. An extraordinary fact in the reception of new knowledge was the example of Delhi. The students in their enthusiasm took the science books to their homes and translated as well as did experiments from them. To quote C.R. Andrews, 1929, quoted by Ramakrishna, a single English book was taken by the pupils themselves and translated page by page into Urdu and then revised by the college staff. Written copies of these translations were handed around or dictated. This made education itself creative, unquote. This example tells us about some of the ways in which a culture receives knowledge by devising its own methods of reception. It is certainly not a passive or unmediated process. The teacher-translator is a well-recognized figure in Indian pedagogy. Ramakrishna calls them intercultural agents. Urdu had an important role to play, spurred on by a drive towards textbook production in physics, chemistry, and mathematics. Various textbooks and translation societies, for example, Aligarh Scientific Society, Delhi College Vernacular Translation Society, Calcutta School Book Society, etc. Examples of which is Munshi Zakaullah's textbooks on mathematics, translated into Urdu from Todd Hunter's book for secondary schools, for which an award was given. Jambekar taught mathematics and astronomy in Marathi at Elphinstone College, and in 1836 published the Marathi translation of her work, Mathematical Geography, to which he appended an essay on the system of Bhaskaracharya, and Ramachandra's revival of, and then there is also Ramachandra's revival of the Indian algebraic tradition. One significant trait of the work done in this era is the linking of translation with commentary. Again, a method of assimilation and extension of received knowledge. From the 16th and 17th century onwards, translations incorporated commentaries. For instance, a treatise on astronomy by Maulvi Shamshanul Haq of Sheikhupura deals with the Ptolemaic system, which the Arabs believed in, vis-a-vis the Pythagoras system revived later by Copernicus. The reasoning involves explanation of the Copernican system, its refinements by Kepler and Newton, and Mohammedan philosophers' response to it. Needless to say, these texts were produced in Urdu and sometimes translated into English to render them into government reports also. J.C. Bose crisscrossed the disciplines of physics and botany, and with Sankhya as his intuitive guide. In this hybrid moment, the colonial scientists produced some original work, not a copy of the colonial original, but a qualitative different work in itself. This is from Deepak Kumar, edited Science and Empire, 1991. Now, I have with me also the example of Gurbani translations, which I've seen. And in that, I have also seen the inclusion of commentary being an essential part of such translations. In fact, if you look at those books, you will see that in the very format, they incorporate commentary. So I have a set of volumes of Guru Granth Sahib, in which produced by Punjabi University, Patiala, and in that they have columns on the page. And in the first column, we have the original Gurbani sentences, verses, and then the second column has in it a Punjabi explanation, a commentary, and the third one has an English translation. So there are 3 columns on that page. Now, these days we are looking at text at formats of different kinds, and perhaps that manner of presenting information is not there in current books. But it's quite interesting as a practice to see those. In other books, I have seen that the text, the Gurbani text, is presented in the original, and then there is a little window given over there for a commentary on that text, along with the translation in English. So these are some examples that I have seen where translation and commentary go on side by side. So this seems to be a practice which is prevalent, which has been prevalent for some time. So we can learn from this work the various solutions tried out regarding also the question of terminology, which so vexes us still. The usage of simple terms instead of borrowed terms, these were the techniques employed. The use of simple terms instead of borrowed terms, or a judicious mix of foreign and indigenous terms, or transliteration. The multilingual glossaries and specialized terminology prepared by teams such as the one set up by Darut Tarjuma Osmania contain thousands of words pertaining to various disciplines. To quote Ramakrishna, the 19th century translator not only intervened in the reception of Western sciences in an informative way, dispelling prejudices about scientific phenomena, but also, quote, contributed to research in translatology, considering issues such as translation of sense versus form, source versus target, oriented approaches, that is sense versus form, sources and the target, and concept of fidelity, methods and strategies for terminology, questions of equivalence, etc., issues which are still being debated upon. So we need not reinvent the wheel totally. That's what I mean to say. And in fact, with regard to Darut Tarjuma, I have to say that the archives exist, and there is a need that there's a suggestion that we can actually digitize those. You see, हम पंजाब वालों से पूछो कि हमारी आधी हिस्ट्री तो रह गई लाहौर, रह गई पीछे, और आधी हमारे पास जो है उसका भी हम इस्तेमाल नहीं कर रहे हैं. तो अगर हमारे पास कुछ है तो उसको हम रखें और उसका इस्तेमाल करें. अब पंजाब में, ईस्ट पंजाब में, on our side, we have Punjab Digital Library, and many of the archives available in our side, on our side, are being digitized because they are lying around in different places and they need to be put together and digitized. So the suggestion is that Darul Tarjuma also is a valuable archive which contains so many glossaries, and we can see that which ones are relevant. If we have the digital library available, then that is available online. Punjab Digital Library is available online, and similarly, if it is available online, then translators can make use of those glossaries, and they can also see which ones are still useful today and whether we need to add to them, because obviously we need to add to them with the growth of science and knowledge, but there may be some that we can still use. So these kinds of things are the ways that we can use and learn from the previous knowledge. The past is to use and learn from, and not to stick to beat other people with. So now, taking off from this history, we can approach translation of knowledge texts, keeping in view that since then the sciences have changed, and so also their epistemic foundations across cultures. Thus, an adequate approach to translation of such texts needs to measure up to several criteria in this regard. So I have listed some of the criteria over here, and those of the students who are going to embark upon translation activity can try and see if this helps them. So one is, of course, to consider the readability and the presentation of information according to different text types in different sciences, in different disciplines. And then another thing to look at is the ideological underpinnings of the text, sensitivity towards sociocultural backgrounds, and the way that there is an episteme at work to understand what that episteme is. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, the role of editing and commentary. So this commentary by the translators themselves or by the peers who look at those translations and edit them or help in editing them. Now, also we need to, next please, we also need to look at the changes in the types of texts. Text types meaning sciences, social sciences, each needing different methodological approaches. Since the discourse of each discipline carries its specific formations. Discursive formations, we know from current theory that they have of peculiar kinds. In the 19th century, social sciences were beginning to establish themselves, and here too many kinds of assumptions were at work. Built into scientific discourse are the implications regarding its source. Where is the knowledge coming from? Its understanding by people, whether it is in a language more easily understood or whether it is abstruse. Which groups of people it excludes or includes, and particularly important in the social sciences. What is being included or excluded, and whether it contains possibilities of questioning and expanding it. So translation is not an activity of just rendering the original text, but also in the for the contemporary needs of the society, how commentaries, and which is anyways, as I mentioned, one of our practices, indigenous practices, can be done. So we have a little bit of a methodology list over here, which is that we can choose between different kinds of translation. We can choose between free translation, and though we say that free translation is useful in literature, poetry, etc., but it can be done in the other knowledge texts as well. And then we can look at the equivalences at different levels in the text: word level, phrase level, sentence level, etc. And then we can add additional words, structures, and at the level of clauses, groups, etc. Next, please. Now, I would also like to talk about the discourse formations. That is, that every text is also a discourse, and in the discourse, particularly in the knowledge texts, we have to have a sense of the discourse structure and of the structure of argumentation. Now, I have been teaching academic writing, and I always tell my students, first understand the structure of argumentation in a text that you read. And then when you write an academic piece of work, then you also look at the structure of argumentation in your own writing. So for this, you see, in English, we have certain kinds of logical relations being marked, certain kinds of markers in the text, logical relations, cause and effect, for instance, as is important, in a knowledge text because it describes causes and effects. Now, also, the little mistakes that can take place, for instance, consequently, mistake for subsequently, a reason has to be ascribed to something. I'll just illustrate that. And then the equivalence of those in the language, in the target language. You see, the structure of argumentation, the structure of the discourse can be different in different languages, but not so very different. I mean, the actual markers, discourse markers, may be different ones, but every language will have discourse markers. And so it is useful for the translator to underline and underscore where the transition points are in a text. Those are always indicated in some way. And when you look at those turning points, or you can those points that are there, you can see you can trace the sequence of the events or the arguments or the cause and effect chain. So what you could just look at, there was a suggestion yesterday also, that we look at the translated text afterwards, after we have translated it on its own and without reference to the original, and then see if it shows linkage. Does it show linkage? Does it show textual coherence when it stands on its own? And it doesn't have to depend upon the source anymore. Next, please. So, for example, I'll just discuss this very briefly, I've taken a sample text, and here I have underlined some of the cohesive elements. That is that generally in a text, you will find a repetition of the same lexical items. So if you look at, say, differences, then you know that this text is about differences. And what differences? That is, there are differences in the DNA. Now, this is what it's about. Then you say, okay, next point is what? Density of differences. Okay, so where there is density of differences, that's significant. It's significant because it separates two genomes. Okay, and once we understand that, then it is the higher the density of differences. See the structure. The higher the density of differences separating two genomes in any segment, the longer it has been since the segments shared a common ancestor. So look at this sentence. It makes a significant statement. And then the reason is given: as the mutations accumulate at a more or less constant rate over time. So there are two parts of this sentence. One is making a declaration, a statement, and then another one is saying as, because these mutations accumulate like this. So you can begin to understand that. And then the last part, so, we say thus, therefore, so the density of differences provide a biological stopwatch. So here we have a clear statement of some process that of understanding that has taken place, and it's important. Next, please. So we can look at how we need to first comprehend, then translate. So if we break up the text into these parts, and we see the structure of argument, and we see the statements and the conclusion, the way it takes place. And though there are differences between languages, it's not too much. Every language will have a structure of argumentation. And तर्क की कोई ज़बान ऐसे नहीं होती है, तर्क तर्क ही होता है. So तर्क पहचाना जाता है कि ये तर्क है. So then what we can do then is, and you can just quickly look at this sample here, that what you can do with the sentences at the sentence level. What you can do is that you can break the sentences, you can reorder the sentences, you can simplify the clauses, and what you need to do is to have a sense of the sentence structures, how they are unfolding. Because, language unfolds in a linear way. And then, of course, there are the building in of the paradigms also. So you have over here the first. So obviously it tells you this first statement, the beginning of it all. And then it makes some important statements, statements which are very, very fundamental in recording in your translation. You have to make this clear. So here, this is a definitional part. Now, what you can do in the translation is to reverse it, this part which I put in curly brackets, as they say in books, all emphasis and modifications are mine. It's working on the bland text and putting in certain indicators. So the curly brackets indicate that this is a definition. What is mitochondrial DNA? It's a definition of that. Now, this can be put in the beginning. Could be put in the beginning, and you could start the thing with saying mitochondrial DNA is dash 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 dash. ये होता है वो, ऐसे उसको define करते हैं, और इसकी वजह से बहुत applications genetics में हुई हैं. So ये इस तरीके से आप उसको निकाल सकते हो. Then you can see if the next sentence you see how complicated the sentences. अब इसमें आप ये देखेंगे कि कई बारी इंग्लिश में क्या होता है, what they found was, it is said that the sentence has been elongated to kind of delay the information. Now you can see as a translator whether you want to keep to this or you want to make the information a little more direct in the form of shorter sentences. So एक fundamental rule है writing में कि आप when you meat cleaver technique they call it, that, yeah. So meat cleaver technique is that you cut up the sentence into parts. And so wherever it is too elaborate, too many clauses, too many subordinate clauses, then see the structure of subordination. Don't upset that, because subordination के structure में बहुत vital links होती हैं. So you can cut up the sentence, but cut up the subordinate clauses, but make sure that the relationships between the clauses are still clear. Next, please. And so, as I've suggested, that the 2 sentences can become 5 or 6 sentences, and the order of the way that items are presented can be reversed, but not the information content. So the information content has to be there, however you choose to bring it out. Now, finally, the question of terminology. In the question of terminology, again, as I said, that there are the next, please. Frequency of use is one thing that you see. It's not an either or question, that you either have very complicated terms or you retain them in the foreign language, in the source language, etc. What you can do is use a variety of techniques and also see the frequency of use of that item. It may be that an item which is from the source language is frequently used, very frequently used. So that argues for its use. Whereas if it were replaced by a very rarely used item in the target language, then it may not serve the purpose. However, you can indicate those alternatives in a parallel glossary. So that is something that can be done. And of course, I'll just run through this quickly. Choice of register. You can be careful about the types of sentences. In science register, we have more passive constructions. We have the absence of personal pronouns, etc. So when you translate it, you have to see whether you, in fact, with personal pronouns, it's almost a uniform rule that we don't say मैंने प्रयोग किया, मैंने ये किया, इसे किया जाता है या समझा जाता है, और उसने किया, जैसे पास्टर पे मैं कैसे देख रही थी, लुई पास्टर पे, तो लुई पास्टर ने ऐसे किया, तो वहां तो आप थर्ड पर्सन यूज करोगे, लेकिन फर्स्ट पर्सन नहीं यूज करोगे किसी भी साइंटिफिक एक्सप्लेनेशन में. सो इस तरह की चीजें आपको ध्यान में रखनी है. एंड टीम ट्रांसलेशन, why? Because again, we need not make translation into a laborious process. We can have people working with us to make the glossaries. It's not that I alone am the supreme commander, and I will make the glossaries, I will do the translation also, and so on. And we can make glossaries in the team, and word banks which we get on internet also, and science dictionaries, etc. So my last comment on that is that also on how technology helps us. That technology today, it's not just to be seen as machine translation and so on, but also the fact that I've been looking at some of the science books that are in circulation for the students to translate. And what I notice is that, apart from the linguistic aspect, the visual aspect is also very important. And it is important to have good illustrations, which I find missing in some of our textbook productions. And that, faced with excellent material on the internet, with all sorts of animations, graphics, designs, and so on, to portray something which, to explain something in science, the textbooks have rather sort of slipshod illustrations, and just in one color, not multicolored, and not very well drawn. And also there are graphics, pop-ups, and so many things that can be done with the help of technology. And what I want to say as a concluding statement is that the aim of referring to past practices earlier in this paper is that if translators of earlier times could do the kind of work that they did without the aid of technology, how much better we might be able to do with the tools at our disposal now. So with that, I conclude my talk. Thank you very much.
Excuse me, is there any scope to ask something? Is it possible? I don't know.
I think at the end,
At the end of
for this presentation, the process of translating knowledge text. And so we'll discuss later. And may I now ask Professor Kishore to speak on the complexities of translating language and culture.
Is it on? I think it is. Okay. Assalamu alaikum. Morning.
If you want, you can sit in.
No, I'm all right. I'm all right. I prefer to stand. Dear young students, I'll begin with you. My address. The others are dear all. Professor Mehndi, if you will permit me, I would like to present my paper. Please indulge me and allow me a little play with the words of the theme of the conference. The theme of the conference is translating cultures, exploring the intersections of language and literature. I'm sure the think team of the conference also perceived the multiple outreaches of the implications of this title formation. Let us see how the phrase translating cultures can be paraphrased, can be translated. The act of translating cultures. meaning to say, when we enter into the performative act of translating from one language to the other, we are actually translating the culture of the language to the culture of the other language. Translating cultures could also mean that translating acts are governed by a culture, a discipline, a grammar of translation. On a more complex argumentative level, one could also say that it is the coming together or colliding of cultures that necessitates translation. So cultures make translations necessary. This is my third point. I could go on. I could spend a lot of more time playing with these phrases. But let me go on. Let me tell you the other thing that struck me about this clever formulation of the theme statement. If you notice, there are two sets of binaries: translation and culture on this side of the hyphen, and language and literature on the other side. Translation is an act manifested through linguistic activity. The literary source as well as the literary product of the transaction manifests the culture text of the two languages involved. My small anxiety, however, lies in the term intersection. I wonder if the relationship between grammar of the language and the culture content in the paired literatures is so neatly laid out? And does it intersect in a transparent, logical way? I leave it to the young scholars and the delegates to mull over this question. I'm happy that the concept note of the conference squarely puts the focus on Urdu language and literature. And I'm sure that the language and literature in discussion in the next 2 days will be mostly Urdu in relation to English. I hope that in these 2 days, we'll be able to hear arguments and samplings of the translational and transactional connect between English and Urdu. This morning, I'm in the mind to bring up some issues which have troubled this area called translation. Translation, of course, is as old as scholarship itself. But translation studies as a discipline has gone through a meandering journey. It has been centered and decentered multiple times. It has been cloistered as practice. It has been vilified as politics. The 18th century Orientalists were practicing translators. The natives were also excitedly translating the Western texts without going into the political questions of power equations, disempowerment, intellectual enslavement, etc. Throughout the 19th and the mid-20th centuries, translators and translations ruled the field. As young people, we were excited about the Russian stories that were coming in to us through English translations. Dickens's tale rendered into Telugu as Rendu Nagarala Katha. The classic Prince and the Pauper as Raju Peda. Likewise, we loved the French classic The Little Prince in Urdu translation as Nanna Shehzada. So also we were proud to read the translation of Rubaiyat-e-Umar Khayyam, just because we did not know the language of the original. We were grateful for the English translation. Readers, scholars, students, everyone gratefully absorbed the spate of ideas, literary forms, and ways of telling and angles of vision. Till we were students of senior classes at school and then on in the senior classes at college and the universities. Pardon me for borrowing a phrase. Till we were senior students in colleges and universities, the subalterns spoke with quite some felicity, without any anxieties. We were quite unself-conscious about speaking the foreign tongue. When we translated into English, it was again the pleasure of seeing if we could do it effectively. Keats's On looking first at Chapman's Homer was a kind of a model. That excitement was the excitement we all said we felt. And that depicted our enthusiasm for translations, ours or others. The field of translation started to get theorized only perhaps in the last decades of the 20th century. It's also around that time that the terms culture and translation intersected one another. The earliest understanding of the enterprise called translation was that it was a negotiation, a give and take, a replacement of one language with another, a bilingual process. Therefore, translation was put squarely in the linguist's domain. It was for most of us applied linguistics, with the linguist calling the shots about grammar, lexis, etc. Even when the translator was confronted with the untranslatability of the culture-specific terms, she negotiated the problem by expanding her tools, often through extra-textual means, like a glossary or an appendix, or some in-text explications, etc. When Mulkraj Anand used terms like jalebi or pajama, whatever, in his text, and then proceeded to explain the same inside the narrative or appended to the text, we quite admired his agility in managing the tricky question of culture translation in such a facile way. Zoom to today. Standing here in this time and day, I can make some broad statements. Language and culture are closely related. Actually, languages manifest culture. There's no doubt about that now. Translation from one language to the other is all about equivalences and not about dominance and empowerment. Translators help establish or foreground commonalities. I'm rather doubtful about that, but we'll leave that question for later. When we look at a translator's enterprise as that of a leveler, an equalizer, a mediator, then the older formula of the processional relationship between the translated text and the translator, the author and the translator, that gets quite easily resolved. There's no leader-follower relationship here. That problem is well out of the way today. In the early post-colonial era, Gayatri Spivak, her voice created the initial anxieties about how the subaltern had lost the power to speak. But now she seems to relax a little bit. She perhaps has discovered that the subaltern has found alternate means of being able to speak. She has also endorsed the notion that translation is the grammar of globalization. I'm referring to her essay, Necessary or Impossible? Question, Translation as Culture. In that she says that translation is the grammar of globalization. What better license for the translator now? Now, if globalization is to be taken as coming together of different cultures, Gayatri Spivak's formulation, translation as culture, is well-founded. It speaks volumes of the significance of translation as being the prime tool for the exploration of culture. But the sea is yet troubled with the ever-growing diversities and burgeoning pluralities. The interaction between languages is giving rise to so many hybridities that the translator's job has become more challenging than ever. Whoever said that one language represents one culture? It's impossible today. Let me now turn to some random samples of what the practicing translator has to say about translation itself. The first muse for me for this morning I have chosen today is a man who represents a very evolved and complex, almost compendious mind of our times. I'm sure many others in this conference will speak of Shamsur Rahman Farooqi. In evoking his name, I'm also tipping my cap to the focus of this conference, Urdu. Farooqi's body of work and range of expressed viewpoints go beyond a defined arc of interests. He is what in my college days we visualized to be man of letters. His versatility fits that definition for me. Shamsur Rahman Farooqi opened a dialogue with the Western literary theory and expanded the horizons of Urdu literary theory with the help of that. His love for Urdu and his acute consciousness of the unsurpassable beauty of Urdu language and literature is well known. In one of his writings, he calls Urdu the citadel of syncretism in literary and linguistic culture. At the same time, by translating the Western literary theoretical precepts into his own critical exercises in Urdu, he showed how this very syncretic culture will benefit by further expansions. Farooqi's works of translations, as well as his comments on the art of translation, are worth looking into. He translated many of his own poems. He also translated his own magnum opus, Kai Chand Sare Asma, into English. He called his translation the mirror of beauty. As the original author, he felt empowered to transcreate rather than translate, with the insider's sense of authority over his own text. Talking of translations of Premchand, Farooqi feels that any translator of Premchand should necessarily read into two versions of Premchand's novels, because Premchand is supposed to have written the same novel in Urdu as well as in English, and changed certain terminologies, certain vocabulary items, certain lexical patterns when he was translating himself. So the translator then has to be familiar with the two languages which the source author has used. And the translator also has to have a great familiarity with the target language. Farooqi advises the translator to go further and translate with the help of an expert, a native of the source language. Let me add a few more observations made by Farooqi in his various writings about the challenges that confront a translator. Speaking about loss in translation, Farooqi speaks about the loss of many visual codes during translation, like verse forms, meter, rhyme, etc. Also, colloquialisms and word texture, they also tend to get lost. The very grammar of the original poem, Farooqi says, gets lost. But these are the very sacrifices and compromises that a translator has to make, because a good translation, however faithful it is to the original text, also has to be a creative work. Farooqi quotes George Steiner. I quote there, I report the speech. Translation is a living spark, a flow of energy between past and present and between cultures. And Farooqi implicitly believes in that. I do not know whether I should read the whole. Let me skip a little bit here. Never mind. It's not going to harm my flow, I hope, yes. I shall mention yet another figure, much admired by. Thank you. I think I'll be all right. I shall mention yet another figure, much admired by all of us. His work, our pride, a man of astounding genius, Rabindranath Tagore. During the many presentations in the skill development workshop, Rabindranath Tagore has been a palpable presence. One can say volumes about this genius, but today I shall speak of him in full focus of today's theme. You all know that Tagore's work in and on translation preceded even the earliest formulations of the theory of translation and translation studies. His death in 1941 is about 4 decades earlier to the groundbreaking work of Susan Bassnett about translation studies and culture. Tagore, if I am not wrong, belongs to the period where the curiosity about the Orient had not yet struck the Occident in any zeal of frenzy. After Gitanjali was finished, Tagore felt, and I'm quoting from a letter that he wrote to his niece, Tagore felt an urge to recapture through the medium of another language the feelings and sentiments which had created such a feast of joy within me in the days gone by. The days gone by being the days when he was creating the Bengali Gitanjali. So the urge to translate, self-translate here in this case, was similar to the initial urge to create. There is no difference for Tagore between the two urges. Rabindranath Tagore was not satisfied with the many translations of his work by others. Perhaps an author is not too trustful of an outsider being capable of translating his work. Rabindranath Tagore belonged to the pre-theory era and did not make any theoretical comments about the art of translation. But the terms that he used when speaking of translation seem to be direct forerunners to the present day theoretical idiom. To begin with, perhaps, Tagore was the first, perhaps, poet to self-translate. Later on, we have many Western writers coming in. In Tagore's opinion, form cannot be transferred from one language to the other. Forgive me and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in the very form of the Bengali Gitanjali and the English Gitanjali, there is a great variation because Tagore believed that a form cannot be transferred. About loss and gain in translation, Tagore was very clear about the compromises the translator has to make. He considered the translated version to be faded meanings. Faded meanings. The original is the original. The translation can be at best only a faded meaning or a weak replica of the original. And he also rued the anemic and spectre-like quality of the translation when it lacks the ruddy bloom of life. A translator, according to Tagore, should use his creative power of transmutation and achieve a rebirth and a reincarnation of the original. Achieve, if it is possible. This will effect a gain in translation, according to Tagore. I'll go to a third name. Please keep pace with me and jump from name to name, if you do not mind. One major critic, because the child has told me I have 10 minutes, already 2 have gone from there, so I count 8 minutes from now. One major critic and theorist of our times, who has been commenting on translation and creating new theoretical terminologies to explain what happens in translation, is Homi Bhabha. His famous term hybridity suggests that all translation goes through a phase of setting up new identities. These new identities are different in degrees from the source point as well as the end point. This area, which Homi Bhabha calls the third space, is a necessary fallout of the interaction of two languages, two cultures, and two individual human minds. At the risk of oversimplifying Bhabha, which is a very dangerous thing for me to do, but at the risk of oversimplifying Bhabha, one can say that he talks of translation not as a transaction between two languages belonging to different cultures. He is saying that the condition of human migrancy, when I travel from one text to the other, that is also a migrancy that Bhabha is talking of, under whatever compulsion brings about the phenomenon of translation. When the cultural borders open up to each other, a new hybrid culture is created, which combines the features of both the cultures and atones the differences. In essence, Bhabha speaks of the ability of translation to foster communication. Differences are not obliterated. Rather, as the translator continues to communicate with both languages, disparities are emphasized and identities are safeguarded. Thanks to all such ingenious minds at work, the translator is no more a shadow lurking apologetically behind the author. She gives a meaningful afterlife to the source text and paves the way for it to live on. Another thing that has been generally agreed upon is that the translator is an insider to her own culture and brings some of it or much of it to bear upon the culture element contained in the book that she is trying to translate. So, what is it that the translator needs to possess in her repertoire of tools? Two things. Simply put, linguistic competence and culture competence. If such a thing is possible. I do not know, I wonder. But yes, that is the demand on the translator. The first type of competence is perhaps easier to describe and expect in a translator. It involves finding equivalent lexical substitutes, grammatically accurate and satisfactory sentence substitutes, etc. But on a complex level, it also requires competence in translating pauses, intonations, cadences, pitch, silences, and so many more such features. Culture competence involves negotiating not only culture-specific lexical terms, but also idiom transfers, moods, modes of interaction. Very possibly a translator's block can occur, not because the translator is not able to comprehend these, but because these culture-bound features in language can create moments of untranslatability. At such times, a good translator needs to go beyond her comfort zone in both the source language as well as the target language and make bold choices and go on to create her third space text. I'll skip a little. Earlier on, when I started to speak, I expressed a slight discomfort with the word intersections. That is, I would like to explain that. Languages are developing constantly. The translator explorer has a plethora of maps to consult, and multiple cultures are boiling away in Get-a-Fix's cauldron. Alas, there is no swig of the magic potion available for the translator. And my dear friends, there are no neat intersections ever between languages and cultures. They are not arranged at logical, measurable angles. The cultures crisscross, interfere with, and interrupt one another merrily. I rather like the word interstices, as used by Bhabha, to replace intersections. Because we are given only some glimpses of clear vision in a picture where we see so many lines crossing one another in any which way. Before I close, I have to make a point that my heart clamors to make. Forgive my emotionality on certain topics, but yes, I am here to share what I feel with you. We live in times of loss of the power of speech, the very right to speak, and the rightness of speech. All of us are under fire and we live in fear of the wrong or the wrongful sentence. In these times of strife, translations can create those moments of recognition of sameness, the possibility of connectedness. We should ask ourselves, do we want to translate the obvious and be bogged down by the differences that strike us in the face? Or do we want to pause, peep into the interstices between languages and cultures, and with gratefulness and humility, seek out what is positive and constructive? As Shamsur Rahman Farooqi felt, translations are difficult, but there is always a moment of epiphany. He called it divine concordance, which tells you that your choices of matter, manner, and idiom are good. Your command over languages, your understanding of cultures, the questions of what to translate, why and how, they stand validated in that one moment of divine concordance. I shall turn to Gayatri Spivak again for my parting line. You see, Spivak is a no-nonsense critic, feminist, theorist. But when it comes to speaking on issues that are close to her heart, she is sheer poetry. Speaking of the art of translation, she says, translation is impossible, but it is not a close-ended death. For translation can be made possible, and I want my young friends to listen to this. Translation can be made possible by becoming what is translated, by becoming that what is translated. You, the translator, has to become that has to be translated. In this becoming is the hope of translation. In this becoming is the hope for cultural diversity and for the world. Is Spivak, I ask you, exhorting the translators of today towards some kind of a negative capability? I wonder. Is she asking them to become the other so that they can take on the heavy responsibility of employing translations in the service of explicating cultures? I leave you with this question. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Dr. Kishore, for a very interesting and comprehensive presentation of translation, your own problems, how you face them, the strategies. We shall, I have to announce here that we'll take questions we will not take questions now because there's no time and the inaugural is just going to happen very soon. But you can put your questions later informally. I'm very sorry about that.
Informally, if I ask the question, it will not carry meaning.
In the plenary, not usually.
Because if I raise the issue with all the people, then it will be meaningful for the translators. Only 1 minute I'll take and not more than that. If you could kindly permit me.
Okay. Yeah. Please make it short.
Now let me introduce first myself. I'm Dr. S. Jamal Muhammad, retired reader from Central Institute of Indian Language in 2004. It is by chance that I have to attend this seminar. One seminar I attended in Central University of Hyderabad, which is, happened last time. So now my question is, first let me congratulate to the readers of the 2 papers, Madam Pushpinder Shayal and Madam Amina Kishore. Madam Pushpinder has elaborately presented a very nice paper, but it's too informative, too technical to understand. And she could not get much time to present her paper in well manner. Anyway, both are congratulated, for their very good papers. So now my question is, though we talk about translation scholastically, many papers are presented, but the private organizations do not call such scholars for their translations of things. I don't know why. One, this is very salient question that scholars from universities are not called for translation of those things. Second thing, what you have translated is what is the guarantee that it is authentic? So what is the process or what is the scope to get authenticity of a translated version? For instance, I must tell you that I had been attached with this, this translation bureau with the ministry in 1973 when I was a student of MA Linguistics in Aligarh University. So a translation project from history books into Urdu I was dealing with. And I found that those translated versions were submitted for vetting. So please let me know whether there is a scope of vetting for such translations, because everything you translate cannot be authentic.
Okay,
so how could we justify? These 2 questions are there. Please.
These questions will be answered later.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
To your satisfaction, I am sure. Yeah. So, Pushpinder Syal presented her paper, which was technical, and the subject also was translating knowledge. And many of the things where I'm, as pointed out now, they were too technical and too scientific. But the paper was exhaustive, and the interesting part was that societies were formed to translate knowledge into Urdu. And this was, of course, done in Hyderabad also. The Darut Tarjuman, the Bureau of Translation in Hyderabad, did a lot of very good work for translating from different areas of science into Urdu. But Pushpinder Singh dealt with form and not only on content. She lamented that many works were not available in our part of Punjab, but they were in Lahore. And she suggested how to get over this problem. The best part of her presentation was her advice to students, and she reached out to them and gave them practical tips. So thank you very much for your presentation. Now the importance of, now Amina Kishore, she traced translation activities in the 18th and 19th centuries and coming down to the 20th and also to the nearly 21st. So that was a very broad landscape that she chose, and also presented different languages, and specifically spoke about Mulk Rajanan and how he commented on his translations done by Premchand. She mentioned Bhava, and about Tagore, I think I have to differ from her because Tagore is not considered a good translator. In fact, he's considered a bad translator. He may have done very good with Gitanjali, but on the whole, Tagore, because yeah, you have to be a different person to translate from one to the other. Now, the importance of translations has been recognized since pre-Islam, prehistoric times. With the introduction of Buddhism in India, Chinese travelers came and translated Buddhist texts into Chinese. Thereby, the whole atmosphere of China changed. Their philosophy, their social life, everything was influenced by these translations. So this has been a very important activity in the ancient times. Later on, when the Bible was translated in China, the Chinese didn't have the name for God. They said the emperor above or the heavenly prince. The Protestants choosing one and the Catholics the other. So the whole thing was very difficult period for them to translate. Now in the 6th century, the Persian Khusro, Shirwane Adil, he sent his physicians to India to collect herbs. And in the process of collecting herbs, he came upon works which were he thought interesting, and he took some back with him after translating the early ones into Pahlavi. These were translated into Arabic later on, and they, under the title, were published as Kalila wa Dimna. Now, Kalila wa Dimna, a whole series of fables from India, from Panchatantra, has been influencing the Arab world. And it is important to say that this translation set the mode for prose writing in Arabic. So it became a classic, and after Kalila with Dimna, many prose activity was launched. Now, of course, we know what happened in the Abbasid period, that Mamun established his Bait al-Hikmah, and this comes to information translation. The translators worked in tandem with others. They were not alone, although Hunayn ibn Isa was supposed to be a very famous translator, but in Mamun's Bait al-Hikmah, there was a whole collection of translators, and they saw that the translation was correct, because one person can have to go wrong. And I think today also, when we translate, we have translation classes. We should have 2 or 3 people to check, to recheck, and just not leave to one person to translate a text. And it is interesting that Ibn Rushd, famous philosopher from Andalusia, when he wanted to translate Aristotle's Poetics, he faced immense problems. How was he to translate comedy and tragedy into Arabic when the nearest equivalents were the panegyric and the satire? So no area or region can afford to ignore the progress of the other areas. And though there was no equivalent to Bait al-Hikmah in modern times, prose writers depended on their own efforts. Many translations were literary and hardly any scientific. Even literary translators faced problems in using equivalent terms in the target language. Unless the translator is given certain liberties, his work becomes the worst of its kind. It becomes word for word. But sometimes translations surpass the originals. The best example of this is Ali Haider Tabatabai's translation of Gray's elegy in an English churchyard. The curfew tolls the knell of parting day. Vidaye roze roshan hai gadar shame ghariban ka. Look at the choice of the word shame ghariban. चरागाहों से पलटते काफिले वे वो बेज़बानों के कदम घर की तरफ किस शौक से उठता है तहखां का ये वीराना है मैं हूँ और तायर आशियानों में and leaves the world to darkness and to me. Yeah, it's very good, but a very difficult of course poems are very difficult to translate because some concentrate on the meter and the prosody, and some concentrate on the literal meaning. So the flavor of the poem, the nuances all get lost. And of course, Mir Taqini's famous verse is absolutely difficult to translate. Naziki uske lab ki kya kahiye, पंखी एक गुलाब की सी है. Now this, what can we say of her delicate lips, liken only to a rose petal? Where is the beauty of Urdu? And the prosaic rendering in English of ek gulab ki si hai. So it is not to discourage translators, but to get them to get into the language, to get into the feel of the language and then translate. I had great difficulty in the beginning when I chose a story of Qurratullah and Haider to translate into Arabic. Now, the cultures are totally different. Arabs have no idea of Parsi cultures, especially of the Parsi way of honoring their dead. So this was a story of the Tower of Silence. And the name of the story is Nazara Darmiyan hai. Now, even the title I couldn't translate. So I was advised not to choose subjects which were of very different cultures. With that, I end this session. Thank you very much, both of you.
What an informative and inspiring session. I thank the distinguished chair, Professor Ismat Mehdi, the eminent speakers, Professor Pushpinder Syal and Professor Amina Kishore, for lending us the treasure of their immense knowledge and allowing us to learn from their experience. I take this opportunity to announce that we have with us the graceful presence of our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Said Ainul Hassan. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your patient listening and keen observation. We shall now take a short break as we will be continuing with our inaugural session at 11:10 p.m. Immediately? Oh, we will be, I'm sorry, there's a slight change. We will